Hello, and welcome to this episode of Dr. K's Psychobabble, taking a journey down the work of Sigmund Freud, probably one of the most famous of psychologists in history. A lot of people know who this guy is. Let's take a look at him again. Here is Sigmund Freud, and we are going to be taking a look at his work in regard to personality. Uh, He had a very unique and interesting view on personality. Then he introduced concepts that were radical at the time and continue to influence our current thinking in psychology. And one of the principles that he brought to the world in terms of the study of personality was he proposed that a lot of the personality actually existed outside of our conscious awareness, what he called the unconscious. Many of the processes that he felt were important in the development of our personality occurred without our knowledge. Now, this idea has for a long time been represented by an iceberg sitting in the ocean. Now, icebergs are huge pieces of ice that are floating in the ocean, and we see the top part, but not many people are aware that a great majority of the iceberg is actually below the surface. So I have a little bit of a graphic here. Let's take a look at Freud's personality model here. We have the surface of the water, which represents the boundary between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. Although we do see some writings about what's a subconscious and a sort of aware, sort of unaware. But we have the conscious mind, the stuff that we're aware of, the unconscious mind, things that we're not aware of, and the ice itself is separated into three parts. And these are the three parts of the personality that Freud has postulated. We start off below the water, completely outside of our awareness is the id. Now, the id represents a person's desires, selfishness, the immediate gratification, all of those things just serving itself. So we are born with id. All of our biological processes, a young child is completely unaware of the needs of other people and is simply a selfish being. We can understand that. Now, go back to the model, we have the ego. Now, the ego develops out of the id, and this is the emerging self awareness of the person. This is our living consciousness. In fact, in the original, my understanding is in the original writings, the word that he was using was I. This is me. This is the awareness I have of me, is what he called the ego. Now, growing out of both the id and the ego, we have this structure of the personality called the superego. And the superego represents the aspects of our personality that reflect the awareness of social norms and limitations on our behavior. So here we have this scenario in which energy is being transmitted among all three of these pieces of the personality, drives from the id, commands from the superego, and the ego balancing this out. So we have essentially the ego is trying to engage in satisfying the needs of the id within the confines of the superego. Now, this model is based on principles that Freud developed. The first of is from the id, is continually seeking pleasure. So the pleasure principle, primary force in the moving of the energy within our personality. And then we have the reality principle. This is the conscious mind that is developing a solution for the needs of the pleasure principled id, keeping in mind the internalized values of the superego. Now, this idea of the the impulses of the id that are selfish and the impulses, the demands of society have been personified within our collective media as the little angel on one shoulder and the little devil on the other. And the ego is represented by that individual in the middle, where the devil is saying, go ahead and take that piece of candy. And the angel is saying, no, you might get caught. It's wrong. And the ego is trying to resolve this. So here's a nice little image of Freud with his super ego on his right shoulder and his id on his left shoulder as he contemplates some sort of decision. So, this is the personality structure of Freud. So, we'll see in other videos how does this develop? How does the energy that's involved in here, how does it focus among the developing human being? How does the ego use defense mechanisms in order to balance the struggles between the id and the ego and the superego, particularly when it's sort of in a rock and a hard place sort of thing, and then the ego has developed mechanisms in order to resolve those conflicts. So this is the basic premise of Freudian psychology: is this id, ego, superego, that a whole bunch of it is below consciousness, just a little bit, little off, a little. The graphic that I use actually shows a lot more, almost like even between what we're aware of and what we're not aware of. But in Freud's writing, way more underneath our consciousness. Um, and that's why he got into his methodologies of free association, dream interpretation, those kinds of things, which actually he proposed gave him access to the raw material within the unconscious as it creeped up through the layers of the consciousness. So here's Personality by Sigmund Freud, and we'll be continuing other videos on Sigmund Freud later. Until then, take care, and I'll see you next time.